Good afternoon, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Jennifer Cooley, and I am the Education and Outreach Manager for the State Historical Museum. During March, which is Iowa History Month, join us each Thursday for an Iowa History 101 webinar, which focuses on Iowa through a cultural history lens. You can learn more about this series and all of our Iowa History Month programs on our website at iowaculture.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you would like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live, all presentations will be recorded. Today, we will trace the history of Irish in Iowa, the second largest immigrant group to come to the state, and how they acquired influence beyond their numbers. And we will hear stories of heroes, rebels, clergy, and criminals. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in a few days. I have disabled the chat function, but if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague Matt Beyer is watching that feature, and we'll prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note, we may not be able to get to all of the questions. Now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Timothy Walch. Timothy is the author or editor of 24 books and over 250 articles, newspaper columns, and reviews on a variety of historical topics. He is also a frequent commenter of historical issues for the Iowa and Minnesota Public Radio networks. Educated at the University of Notre Dame and Northwestern University, Dr. Walch was employed by the National Archives and Records Administration in Washington, D.C., before moving to Iowa to become the longest serving director of the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library in West Branch. Throughout his career, Dr. Walch has been an active advocate on behalf of state and local history. He has been appointed by 4 successive governors of Iowa to serve as a member of the Iowa State Historical Records Advocacy Board. He was also a member and past chair of the Iowa Center for the Book. Irish American by birth, Dr. Walch is an avid book collector who acquired thousands of books and other research materials on the Irish in America. He donated these materials to St. Ambrose University in Davenport, where they form the core of the Timothy Walch collection of Irish and Catholic Americana, one of the largest such special collections in the Midwest. And now I'm happy to turn it over to Timothy to begin the webinar.
Thanks, Jennifer. Well, Walch, everyone, as they say in Ireland. Happy St. Patrick's Day and welcome to this presentation on the history of the Irish in Iowa. Well, Jen filled you in on my professional background, but let me add a bit about my Irish roots. My own people came from Ireland and settled in Michigan beginning in the 1820s. They were named Egan, Flanagan, Butler, Whalen, Cummins, and Shields, among others, and came from Wexford, Kilkenny, Tipperary, and Westmeath, and came to this country through New York and Quebec. I was born and raised on the east side of Detroit in an extended community of aunts and uncles and cousins. That I was isolated but nurtured is without question. In fact, I like to tell people that I was 12 years old before I realized that Irish Catholic Detroiters were not, in fact, God's chosen people. When I moved to Iowa in 1988, I began my odyssey to learn more about the Irish who settled here. The result is this slim book, that Irish Iowa, that was published in 2019. Our program today will follow the topical outline that I used for the book and will feature 26 slides that also appear in the book. We'll leave a few minutes at the end of the program for questions and commentary, and I encourage you to share your own memories of your own Iowa Irish ancestors. One important note, since this is a webinar, you will have to share those comments via the Q&A box. My colleague Matt will read what you have written. Here's a brief overview of today's webinar. I'll begin with the earliest Irish immigrants to Iowa. These individuals were the true adventurers who were willing to come to Iowa a decade before statehood. The first bishop, Matthias Loris, found these Irish to be both a blessing and a curse, and this topic will tell of the challenge of attracting Irish settlers to a virgin land. Second, I will shift to the journey from Ireland to Iowa that was precipitated by famine in the years after 1846. I'll make note of the pilgrims who established the monastery at New Mallory and the town of Wexford in Allamakee County. Third, I will talk about the vital role played by bishops and pastors in the nurture and development of Irish communities in Iowa. The two bishops who succeeded Loris, Clement Smith and John Hennessy, for example, were born in Ireland, and they were secular as well as spiritual leaders of the Iowa Irish. Next up will be the story of the Irish women who immigrated to Iowa. In addition to tens of thousands of wives and mothers, there was also a mighty band of devoted women religious. These women established orders that provided hundreds of Irish-born nuns to staff hospitals, asylums, and schools across the state. It must be said repeatedly that Irish women, both lay and religious, changed Iowa's landscape, and those changes are highlighted in this topic. The story of the Iowa Irish in the cities is next. Often arriving in Iowa with limited funds and only basic skills, the Irish sought comfort in the neighborhoods of Dubuque and Davenport, where their countrymen had settled before them, and later went on to Iowa City and Des Moines and Sioux City and other Iowa cities. This pattern of settlement of neighborhoods named Little Dublin is similar to what happened in eastern cities such as Boston and New York. Then it's on to those lucky Irish who fulfilled their dream of purchasing rich farmland and pushed beyond the cities to Iowa's rolling prairies. Although isolated from their compatriots in the cities, these industrious Irish farmers never forgot the land of their birth and established small rural communities that recalled the landmarks of their heritage. Most of the Iowa Irish, however, were not fortunate enough to purchase rich farmland, even at $1.25 an acre. I'll touch on the story of the Irish working class, the men who built the railroads and worked in the building trades and factories and shops. At that point, I'm going to read a brief interlude from the book that ties together farming, railroads, and heroism, all in the person of a young girl, Kate Shelley. She came to be seen as the very definition of Iowa Irish bravery and became a national celebrity. The next topic is Irish nationalism in the Hawkeye State. Throughout the 19th century, the Irish in Iowa celebrated their ethnicity and championed the cause of Irish independence. The movement reached a high point in the 1880 visit to Iowa of Charles Stewart Parnell, the leader of the New Ireland campaign. This topic culminates in a discussion about a false rumor, we might call it fake news, that the Iowa Irish were planning a raid on Canada to do who knows what. I will also talk about anti-Irish hostility. Beginning in the 1850s, some Iowans supported the Know Nothing or Nativist Party to resist any further immigrant influence in the Hawkeye State. The Irish were among the most visible targets of Know Nothing hostility. Here I'll recount one of the ugliest chapters in Iowa history, the founding of the American Protective Association in Clinton, Iowa in 1892. The Irish were deeply affected by the APA. I'll go on to tell the story of the progress made by the Irish community in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, followed in the 1920s by the hostility from an emerging Ku Klux Klan. The conflict came to a head with a dilemma in 1928. Should the Irish of Iowa vote for their native son, Herbert Hoover, for president, or should they vote for their fellow Irishman and Catholic, Alfred E. Smith? Next, I'll touch on a decade of economic depression, beginning in 1930, followed by 5 years of war. The sheer struggle to survive in the 1930s is told through the memories of Leo R. Ward, a priest, author, and most importantly, a son of Melrose, Iowa. His book, Holding Up the Hills, provided a portrait of how the rural Irish of Iowa coped with drought and crop loss. I then shift to Waterloo to focus on the Sullivans an ordinary family who suffered through extraordinary loss during World War II. The patriotism of the Iowa Irish is epitomized in the sacrifice made by the 5 brothers who died together at sea. And my second interlude from the book will be to read a section on the Sullivan family. Like Kate Shelley, the Sullivans came to define Iowa Irish sacrifice. If I have time, I'll talk about the determination of the Iowa Irish to carry on the traditions of their ancestors. Iowans of Irish ancestry live in every one of the state's 99 counties, and that ancestry is celebrated annually in dozens of St. Patrick's Day parades across the state. Here I'll mention the ways and means that Iowans renew and refresh their determination to stay forever Irish. These brief remarks on a dozen topics fit together like a quilt to reflect the diversity of the Irish experience in the Hawkeye State. It's important to note, however, that my talk today and even my book only skim the surface of what it means to be Irish in Iowa over the past century and a half. More research remains to be done, and I invite you to become historians of your own Iowa Irish heritage. I want to begin my slides or begin the presentation with a poem from the Gazette, but not from Cedar Rapids, from Davenport, Iowa, in July of 1847. It's called Ireland's Appeal by Mrs. L.H. Sigourney, and I'm just going to read 3 stanzas. Wake, glorious nation of the West, wake to thy sister's woe. Her earnest hands to thee are spread, thy liberal aid bestow. Bid thy rich harvests load the wave, unlock compassionate stream, and with the surplus of thy wealth, her misery redeem. Haste, pluck the poisoned arrow forth that rankles in her breast, and win the blessing of the skies, O fair and fruitful West. It's the earliest appeal that we can find of the Irish in Iowa calling on their countrymen to help assist the Irish, who, of course, in that terrible year of 1847, were starving so badly. But our story begins really with this man, Matthias Loris, and I'm sure you can guess right from the get-go, he's not Irish. In fact, he was born in Lyon, France, and accepted a calling to the missions of the United States as a missionary, a Catholic priest, and migrated to Mobile, Alabama, where there was a sizable French community, and in fact did quite well as a priest, as a pastor, eventually as vicar general, the number 2 in the diocese, and a founder of Spring Hill College. So it was no surprise in 1837 that Loris was selected to become the first bishop of Iowa, the first bishop of Dubuque. Loris was determined to bring Catholics to his new diocese almost from the time of his consecration. In 1841, he initiated contact with the Irish Immigrant Society to seek its involvement in attracting the Irish to his city. Most importantly, he used pamphlets, advertisements, and letters to the editor to champion the opportunities that he had in this new state, this new territory, and his new diocese. The challenge he faced, of course, was to attract these immigrants from a country that was devastated by poverty and eventually by famine. Between 1846 and 1855, nearly 1.5 million of Irish sailed for America to what they hoped would be a better future. Loris offered them that better future. In fact, he went so far as to visit Ireland in 1849 to assess the poverty that he saw there, but also to encourage priests and others to come to this country, including the priests at the Abbey at Melleray in Wexford. And of course, they eventually came and established the Abbey at New Melleray. The bishops who followed Loris were also Irish. Clement Smith, John Hennessy, John McMullen, and others were all of Irish descent. And so they defined the very nature of what it meant to be a bishop in the state of Iowa at the time. Now, of course, Bishop Loris, as a Frenchman, struggled, of course, to deal with poverty and crime in his diocese. Before he even arrived, the very first murder in the state, sad to say, was committed by an Irishman on another Irishman in Dubuque, two roommates. Eventually, the criminal or the murderer was convicted by a jury of Irishmen and unfortunately hung. So when we make reference to criminals, unfortunately, we have to make reference to the city of Dubuque, the Irish criminal, the first criminal to be executed in the state of Iowa. Also, by the way, the first child to be baptized, a Catholic baptism, was also in the state of Iowa. Well, Bishop Loris was aided by Charles J. Corry. You can see an image of him here. It's the only image we know of him. Throughout the 1840s, he led a committee of Iowa Irishmen to writing to Catholic newspapers in New York and Philadelphia with letters about opportunities that were here in the state. He validated the reality of the prosperity that we could find here in the land that was available for purchase and for development. He wanted to assure readers that he was no huckster. He spoke for the Irish who were already living in Dubuque and Davenport to say, come visit. Yes, you're struggling with poverty in your state, but we offer you opportunities here. Corry wrote to the Irish, I have had ample opportunities of bearing witness to the testimony of many able and respectable writers who unite in giving Iowa the title of Garden of America, the El Dorado of the West. He added that Irishmen unite in saying that Iowa's wheat and oats are nothing inferior to those of Ireland, and I've never seen better potatoes in Ireland than those raised in Iowa. So maybe that's a new Reagan t-shirt. Better potatoes in Ireland. Never seen better potatoes in Ireland than those raised in Iowa. So the appeal of writing to, first of all, to newspapers in New York and in Boston to attract the Irish across the country, but also eventually to encourage those settlers to come via New Orleans, and we'll have more to say about that. The challenge, of course, was tremendous, both the cost in bringing people to the state, but also to the country. Here we see an illustration of the journey that they took, leaving their native land to come to Iowa. Religion, of course, was central to the Iowa Irish, and that was without question. I mentioned earlier the priests at Mellery who came because Bishop Loris offered them land, which they could then develop, raise crops, support themselves, but also from Bishop Loris's point of view, provided them with opportunities to work among their fellow countrymen, but also to add new souls to their congregations. Also, I wanted to make mention of Father Thomas Hoare, who led a congregation through the port of New Orleans, up the Mississippi River to what was called Wexford, then later Garryowen, to settle the first community or colony of Irishmen here in the state, a formal colony. And again, it was this effort to attract and draw people who were so much in need. The appeal that Iowa had for settlement was evident in a quote that appeared in the Burlington Hawkeye about that time. And it's, I'm sure, tongue-in-cheek, because the editor noted it will not be long before the most difficult place in the world to find an Irishman will be in Ireland itself. Well, that was certainly an exaggeration, but they did come, pushed by oppression and famine in Ireland, and pulled by at least the potential of rich farmland, which they might purchase, and unlimited opportunity. In the State Historical Society, I found a wonderful letter from Alex Aiken, who put it bluntly and almost poetically in a letter he sent to a friend back in Ireland. I would rather live in Ireland if I could live as well, he wrote. The land here requires no manure or drains. It will grow potatoes of the best quality without manure. Best potatoes without manure. There is no disease. And of course, because of the potato blight in Ireland, disease was one of those words that left them with what we might call today post-traumatic stress syndrome. And so they came in great numbers. This is an extraordinary advertisement that I found in the Waterford Daily Mail from 1851. And I made mention earlier of advertising, letters, pamphlets. It was kind of the social media of the day to try to attract and draw people to this country. This advertisement appeared on page 3 of the Daily Mail on October 18th of 1851. It promises a splendid journey, now there's fake news for you, on a packet ship with a name that portends the future of a people in a new land. I couldn't resist having an illustration about the good ship Iowa. Now, as you can see, they're coming through New Orleans. Why New Orleans as a port of entry? Well, you can see that the company, the shipping company, says the following: New Orleans is the highway to the far west of America, proclaimed the text. Steamers of great size and speed run daily from it, carrying passengers at, the key words here, low fares, thousands of miles up the Mississippi and Missouri River to the rich districts of Illinois, Missouri, and other Western states, Iowa, of course, included, in all of which land is cheap, another key word, and fertile, and the wages are universally high. So they came up the Mississippi River and they came across the Midwest to Iowa. Once they arrived, they established themselves in what we might call ethnic islands, in Dubuque, in Davenport, Muscatine, Iowa City, Fort Dodge, Emmitsburg, Sioux City. Also often in communities, as I mentioned earlier, with the designation Little Dublin, as a way to sort of re-stimulate and re-encourage their ethnic identity. Now, before I get too far, I also want to mention the ladies. As Abigail Adams would say, remember the ladies. This is Mother Mary Frances Clark, who moved the Sisters of Charity from Philadelphia to Dubuque in 1843. The historian Hasia Dinner, that's D-I-N-E-R, writes that orders of nuns worked among Irish women in America and confirmed Irish values. They viewed as central a woman's economic function and saw that the salvation of souls and the eradication of poverty were commingled as inseparable goals. I think that's very important. The role that women religious played in society at that time was to provide compassion and assistance to those most in need among the cities and the communities in not just Iowa, of course, in all across the country. And the Sisters of the Blessed Virgin Mary were very important, Sisters of Charity of the Blessed Virgin Mary. It's hard to measure the impact of these sisters on tens of thousands of children who attended Iowa's parochial schools. Of course, the order also expanded to Chicago, and untold numbers of children who were cared for in asylums and also in hospitals. Before I want to go on, of course, the Sisters of Charity of the Blessed Virgin Mary had a reputation of being pretty tough. The letters BVM at the end of their names in Chicago, I'm told, stood in the minds of some young boys for the words black-veiled monsters. I don't think that was the case, so I don't want to be unfair to them, but I did want to mention that. Well, this is the other order I want to make note of, the Sisters of Mercy, who came to Iowa City. You can see this is from Iowa City in 1869. A small group of these sisters settled in Iowa after learning that many Irish Catholics were sick and in need of direct assistance. By the way, 1 in 6 hospitals in the United States have some connection to the Mercy Order, to the Mercy Sisters. And in Iowa City, this was where the teaching was done by the University of Iowa's College of Medicine for about the first 30 years here in the city. So from about 1873 to 1893. Irish Catholics were sick and in need of direct assistance. They were led by Mother Mary Bormeo Johnson. The sisters embraced this calling in Davenport and then came across to Iowa City. Mother Bormeo was strong, articulate, compassionate Irish woman, gained a substantial notice in Davenport and in Iowa City. She knows how to deal with men was a common description of Mother Mary Bormeo. Well, I also want to make mention of the fact the construction of Catholic churches. This was an important center, a locus of achievement for the Irish, and they put a lot of their sweat equity into that process. Many of the Irish arriving in Iowa lacked the funds to build land, but they were determined to build churches. They stayed in the cities and took up jobs as laborers and worked in the mines or worked on the railroad. That shelter and work and worship and socialization were critical, so their lives was very self-evident. In Iowa City, one of the interesting developments, of course, was when the Irish first got here, there weren't enough of them to build their own church, a St. Patrick's church, and so they had to share a church with St. Mary's, with the Germans, and that church was going to be St. Mary's. Well, the two groups worked together to make the task of fundraising and worship more palatable. The statuary in the church was divided with the German saints to the left and the Irish saints to the right of the main aisle. To this day, St. Boniface, the patron saint of the Germans, and St. Patrick, the patron saint of the Irish, share the sanctuary at St. Mary's in Iowa City. Now, the number of Irish in the city continued to grow, of course. What you see here is St. Patrick's. The bishop agreed in 1872 to the new parish was opened less than a mile from St. Mary's. The Irish of Iowa City finally had their own worship space, and St. Mary's became known as the German church. Well, on to the farms of Iowa. This is Patrick Kelly, who left Ireland in the 1850s and established a farm in Benton County, homesteading on land that he purchased for $1.25 an acre. The Kellys were exceptional in the sense that they had the money to purchase land. They came from County Kilkenny and came to Iowa with their 4 oldest children in 1855, then settled in 26 miles west of Cedar Rapids. He acquired the land from the government. I want to add to it, here's Mary Ryan Kelly, who traveled with her husband. She looks tired, I must say. She looks, in fact, exhausted. There was a popular notion among many in the 19th century that farm life was idyllic and that the wife's role was to maintain the home for her farmer husband, raising the children while he toiled in the fields. But in addition to her domestic chores, Irish farm wives devoted time to raising crops and livestock. To say that farming was labor and capital intensive is an understatement. It's common to find women working in tandem with their husbands in planting and harvesting crops, as well as raising hogs and chickens. Now, a slightly different form of rural employment was the boarding house. This is a boarding house run by the Gatens family. I'm sure many of you will know the name Gatens. Matt and Mike Gatens, Hawkeye basketball players, come from this line. Irish families were looking for opportunities to make a living in support of themselves and could not yet afford to buy land, but they did build boarding houses. They were common and offered meals and socialization. They were cooks for railroad workers and the wagons to work as draymen. Now, hard work and determination led to success and pride in ownership. This is the Kelly Homestead in Benton County, about 1900. The Kellys raised wheat and hogs. The entire family was needed to get these commodities to mill in the market. The family members remember hauling sacks of grain and dressed hogs by bobsled to Iowa City, which at the time, the early years, was the closest market town. Eventually, feed mills were erected in Marengo, a closer community to them than Iowa City. By the later decades of the century, they were raising corn and oats, along with wheat and hogs on the Kelly farm. The Kellys were substantially successful. And I want to read just a brief quote from the Iowa State Register about another Irish farmer named Jerry Maher. This appeared on July 16th of 1905 in the paper. On page 19 was a picture of Maher and his family. Noted that Maher was the owner of the most valuable farmland in Iowa. The Register went on to detail that what he'd achieved since his arrival from Ireland. He had come to this country when a young man, worked out and saved his earnings until he had $700, and then bought a small piece of land, rented more, and kept on adding to his holdings. All the time a little in debt, but all the time gaining. The editors summed it up by saying, Maher has shown what an Irish-American citizen can do in 30 years. And indeed, whether it was the Kellys or the Mahers or other groups, there was no question that you could find success in Ireland. Well, not every single Irishman, of course, could purchase farmland. Farming was one opportunity for them, but the Irish became, of course, the backbone of the railroad industry. This is an image that captures workers driving piles on a railroad bridge in Sioux City. Railroad work, of course, was brutal. Skilled workers surveyed and graded the land, and then the less skilled workers dropped the ties, laid the rails, drove the spikes. They worked in all kinds of weather, 12 months a year. On a good day, workers could lay 2 miles on level ground. By the end of the 1850s, they had laid about 500 miles of track. By the 1870, the number exceeded 3,000. By 1890, the rails had reached just about every corner of Iowa. Aiding in this expansion, the federal government donated over 4 million acres of public land to the railroads, which the railroads then in turn sold to their railroad workers. And in fact, that's where I want to read this brief section on Kate Shelley, because the Shelley family was among the railroad working families that purchased a small amount of land. But of course, farming was a precarious occupation, even for those who had acquired some of this land from the railroads. The Shelleys were typical Irish homesteaders. They had a substantial mortgage, and they needed additional income to pay their bills. In that effort, Michael worked as a section hand on the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad. His wife maintained the farm, and Kate minded her brothers and sisters. Tragedy struck the family in December 1878 when Michael died suddenly of unexplained causes. Mother and children were now left to fend for themselves, and there's no question that they struggled without the additional income from Michael's railroad work. Everything changed on the dark night of July 6, 1881. A storm that struck Boone County that night was remarkable, and the rain came down in torrents. Living proximate to the CNN tracks, the Shelleys could hear a locomotive moving slowly toward the bridge at Honey Creek to determine the state of the railbed. The Midnight Express, a passenger train, was expected soon. If the bridge washed out, the fate of the express was in peril. Kate saw the light on the utility train, called a pusher, and as it moved to the bridge, the light was gone. Kate feared that the pusher had dropped into the creek and the bridge was out. Acting with exceptional courage, she struggled to the bridge, determined that it was gone, and then crawled the track until she reached the station at Moingona. Her warning set the agent into action. The Midnight Express was saved from ultimate destruction. And she, of course, became a great hero. The family was feted with gifts and gold medals. It did save the family from perilous destruction, but it also was the first indication, of course, of what it means to be an Iowa celebrity. I also wanted to make just brief mention here of the work as drayman. This is, by the way, a wagon operated by the Mulgrew Coal and Ice Company of Dubuque. Of course, the name Mulgrew is well known in the Dubuque area, and for those of you who watch television will know the actress Kate Mulgrew, who comes from that family, from that city. She plays Catherine Janeway on Star Trek Voyager, and she was in the soap opera Ryan's Hope. The Irish of Iowa never lost their connection to the old country. And this, of course, is the picture of Charles Stewart Parnell, who arrived here in 1880. He was a leader of the New Ireland campaign, a member of Parliament. On February 27th of 1880, very tired Charles Stewart Parnell, he had come to this country in 1880 to raise money for to address a new famine in Ireland and also to petition for home rule. He generated interest among the Irish across the country and particularly here in Iowa. And so he arrived on February 27th. He arrived in Dubuque on a train from St. Paul. The arrival was something of a crescendo, complete with a band, welcoming speeches, and even a cannon shot. Parnell stressed that Irish land was fertile and could support a population twice the island's current size if managed properly. He concluded his remarks with a passionate appeal for funds for the starving people of Ireland. A day of rest in Davenport, then Parnell took the train to Des Moines. On his arrival, there were 3 speeches of welcome, a 32-gun salute, a parade, and a reception, all before he had uttered a word. And then he was gone. In an effort to sustain momentum in Iowa, Parnell directed an associate to stay in Des Moines, continue to speak out for the cause, and collect donations. They donated money, and eventually the Irish in our state named a city, Parnell, for Charles Stewart Parnell. Well, Parnell, of course, came from Ireland, but there were natives here in Iowa, Irish who were champions of Irish independence and the Irish cause. This, of course, is John Brennan. No man was determined to champion the Irish cause of independence more than Brennan. Late in 1880, a rumor emerged that a select group of Irish fanatics in Iowa were planning an attack on Canada. For what purpose, who knows? But the Prime Minister of Canada was certain that there were Irishmen in Iowa who were about to attack his country, and he implored the State Department to investigate. These supposed fanatics were loosely associated with the Fenian movement, but who could be the men behind this plot, and what was their connection to Iowa? Such rumors seemed hardly credible. The State Department sent an investigator out to the state. The specific targets were 2 well-known Irishmen, John Brennan of Sioux City and Michael Gannon of Davenport. The investigation started with Brennan, confirmed that he was a man of integrity, not a warrior or a conspirator. And the same was concluded about Gannon: no collusion, no conspiracy. And in fact, most Iowans, I don't think, were threatened by any of this. In fact, that same year, or excuse me, I shouldn't say that same year, a few years later, William Larrabee, the governor of Iowa, wrote to the editor of the Irish World to reaffirm Iowa's commitment to the Irish. Larrabee wrote, "Home rule for Ireland should find an echo in every truly American heart. It is indeed gratifying to see that this just demand of the Irish people has become a vital issue." So Larrabee and other Iowans were in support of Irish independence. I want to also make mention of the Sharon family, who published the Catholic Messenger, which was the voice of the Irish community here in the state. It's still published as a newspaper of the Diocese of Davenport. The Messenger and the Sharons were particularly important in addressing the charges of the American Protective Association, which, although it has a sort of a benign name, was a very virulent anti-Catholic organization. The Sharons and the newspaper urged Iowans to, and the Irish Catholics in particular, to remain calm in response to the APA. Fred Sharon, who was the editor at the time, urged Catholics to pursue a long-heated course to avoid the animosity and the vitriol of the APA, do nothing and not have any martyrs here. Although the APA membership was impressive, the organization had little purpose and policy other than opposition to Catholicism. By 1898, the organization had lost its influence and its membership evaporated. It died with its founder in 1911. I want to add just very quickly one cartoon here. This is an editorial cartoon by Thomas Nast. If you can see I don't know if my pointer will there. Notice, by the way, this is a mitre of a Catholic bishop. It's got teeth in the mitre. They're acting as alligators to attack these poor Protestant children because of the destruction of their public school. And you can see the Vatican lurking in the background. There were some very nasty anti-Catholic cartoons back in the 19th century, many of them directed at the Irish. Well, I also want to make mention of the hostility of the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan organized rallies in the 1920s. It was a source of tension across the nation and certainly here in Iowa. We were not immune. The power of the Klan in the appeal in the 1920s was limited and varied substantially from county to county. Chapters known as claverns appeared in Iowa in the early 1920s. And by 1926, there were an estimated 40,000 members in over 100 claverns. Happy days are here again. This is a picture of Doyles Pub, just about the time it opened. I wanted to make mention of Doyles in part because I'm sure if you've been to Iowa City, you know it's sort of an institution here. Harold is here standing behind the bar. These are the booths where people, youngsters, co-eds would canoodle. Harold didn't quite like it. He would march up and down the aisles, making sure that everyone was proper and keeping their hands to themselves. The other thing I want you to notice, by the way, is this extraordinary mirror behind the bar. Now, he kept the mirror that way for a while, but then covered it up. And people said, Harold, why did you cover up the mirror? And he said, people don't like looking at themselves when they're drinking my beer. Also, by the way, as you can see from the caption, it was among the first to serve green beer on St. Patrick's Day. By the way, Harold Donnelly was one of the extended family members from the Ryan clan that I mentioned earlier. Well, of course, here's Harold once again. He's here in the center dressing up on St. Patrick's Day. It was always a special day. And he eventually served as a Johnson County supervisor. I'm keeping track of the time here. I don't want to short you. This is our own version of Hoosiers. This is the Iowa Irish in Melrose, the Fighting Shamrocks, who won the state basketball championship in 1937. The first undefeated championship team in the state. It was an extraordinary little community that suffered through the Great Depression, and the story, of course, is told, as I mentioned in the book by Father Leo Ward, Holding Up the Hills. It tells the story of Melrose and Tyrone and many of the other small communities. The book is out of print, but it's something of a minor classic. I also wanted to point out too, by the way, that the state basketball championship that year happened to fall during Holy Week. And so after the team had won the state basketball championship, it was thought to be unseemly to hold a parade for the team during Holy Week. So they had to delay it till the next week to celebrate the basketball team, keeping things in order. Well, here, of course, is the picture that is familiar to all of you who visited or know the Waterloo area. These are the 5 Sullivan brothers. The oldest was George, who was born in 1914, followed by Frank in 1916, Genevieve, the only girl, in 1917, Joe in 1918, Matt in 1919. Then there was a break with the arrival of Al, and of course, they all served together on the USS Juneau. That is not allowed, by the way, by the Navy, but they made an exception because 2 of the boys, the 2 oldest boys, had served previously. They said, we'll sign up our brothers, but our family motto is we stick together. And so they made an exception to allow the 5 boys to serve together. And it was an extraordinary measure of bravery and achievement. But I want to just read a passage from the book. So all 5 are serving on the Juneau. The fate of the 5 Sullivan brothers was determined on November 13th, 1942, during the Battle of Guadalcanal, when 2 Japanese torpedoes hit the ship near the ammunition magazines. The Juneau exploded and sank almost immediately. In assessing the damage, the senior on-site commander assumed that no one could have survived the blast and did not order a rescue. Although some men survived, all 5 of the Sullivan brothers were lost. The news finally reached the Sullivan family on July 11th, 1943. As Tom Sullivan was preparing to go to work, 3 men in Navy uniforms knocked on the door. Tom had heard rumors of the battle and knew that the Juneau had been in action. When he saw the Navy men on the porch, he knew why they were there. Which one, Tom asked. The response was startling. I'm sorry, all 5. The news that day changed the future for the Sullivan family forever. Such an enormous sacrifice epitomized the war effort, and the Sullivan family was immediately inundated with expressions of sympathy from the President of the United States as well as ordinary American citizens. They did their part became the new motto of the Sullivan contribution to the war effort. And the physical symbol of this contribution came in the form of a new destroyer named the Sullivans. The ship was commissioned in San Francisco on April 4th. Both Tom and Alida Sullivan were present for the event and found solace in the practice heaped on their boys, the praise heaped on their boys. Both of them participated willingly as a form of therapy. I lost my own 5, Alida told a reporter, but there are millions of other boys I feel belong to me. They're my family now. And the War Department took advantage of that sentiment. Over the next 2 months, Tom and Alida Sullivan were sent on a whirlwind tour of defense plants to rally workers to produce more and better armaments. By the middle of June, family members had attended over 230 rallies and spoken to more than 1 million workers. The notoriety surrounding the Sullivan sacrifice was further enhanced by the production of a motion picture about their lives. The Sullivans, later known as the Fighting Sullivans, was a B-grade picture that concentrated on the lives of the boys before their Navy service. It premiered on February 1944 and received respectable reviews. So the Sullivans became extraordinary contributors to what we mean by sacrifice of the greatest generation. Well, here we are about to move on to the last part of our presentation today, and I wanted to talk a little bit about Dan Daly of Iowa City, a good friend to all Irish causes, and of course, the embodiment of St. Patrick. Although, as anyone who knows much about the history of St. Patrick, we don't have an image of the saint. We have no idea what he looks like, so I can't vouch for the fact that St. Patrick had a full bushy beard. But here he is, Dan Daly. This is several years ago, because you can see St. Patrick's, the old St. Patrick's before the tornado is still in existence. Dan appears at St. Patrick's, the new St. Patrick's, on St. Patrick's Day, also in the St. Patrick's Day parade. And in many ways, he epitomizes what goes on in other communities across the state. Even to this year, for example, in Davenport, where they have a St. Patrick's Day parade, the Grand Marshal was Sister Joan Lisinski, who was the past president of St. Ambrose University. Sister Joan is Italian and Polish. She's not Irish, but on St. Patrick's Day, everybody gets to be Irish, and you might even get the opportunity to be the Grand Marshal. So a tip of the hat to Dan Daly, and thanks to his contributions to this book. I also want to make mention of Irish Fest. Since 2007, the Cedar Valley Irish Cultural Association has sponsored Irish Fest, which is a 2-day event held each August that draws tens of thousands of people to downtown Waterloo. And it's no small enterprise. Over 1,200 volunteers work for months to prepare for the celebration. It's no surprise that Iowa Irish Fest is among the top 5 Irish festivals in the nation. It's definitely become a Midwest fest, as the director, Chad Shipman, has said. It's outgrown the Cedar Valley, and our followers from Facebook are from all over the world. The spirit, in many ways, of the festival is best captured in the words of their association's president. The Irish in Iowa have done such a fine job of melting into their communities, he observed, that we felt it was time to draw them back out a bit and show them off to their neighbors, as well as many visitors as we could. I also want to make note of Irish culture in Dubuque. This is the McNulty School of Irish Dance and their regular performers at the Irish Hoolie. The whole evolution of Irish identity in Dubuque has been renewed and restored. That certainly was the case once with the reestablishment of the Ancient Order of Hibernians in Dubuque in 2005. The AOH first came to Dubuque in 1891, but was disbanded by the middle years of the 20th century. A renewed interest in the AOH emerged in the first years of this century as the Irish made a concerted effort to hold a festival of Irish music and culture each October. That first initial effort led to what is today an annual Irish Hoolie, now held on the 4th Saturday of each August on the grounds of the historic Dubuque Star Brewery. In cooperation with the AOH, the Hoolie organizers provide a great day of entertainment and education and raise tens of thousands of dollars for worthy causes. And my last slide is something that's coming up in the next few months. This is Bishop Thomas Zinkula. I don't believe that Bishop Zinkula of Davenport is Irish. I know he's partly, at least, of Czech and Slovak heritage, but he's leading a tour of Ireland for those Irishmen, and in fact, anyone interested would like to go. And I added this slide just yesterday because it reminded me that in this year and in this state and on this day, it's great to be Irish, and it's great to have an opportunity to visit the old country. So with that, I'm going to turn my microphone over to my colleague, Matt, who will read either questions or comments that you might have. We have about 10 minutes, so let's go forward. Matt?
Yeah, well, thank you, Tim. We have some great responses already and some great questions. So I think what we'll do, we'll ask questions first, and then we'll end with—
That's great.
A list of our personal thoughts. And if you have any, please continue to write them in the Q&A. But like we say, we have some time, but we may not get to all of them, just be aware. But let's start with our questions. And our first question comes from Diane Rarick. And she wrote, "My Western Iowa Irish ancestors were Protestant. How were their Iowa immigration destinations and communities different than the Irish Catholics?"
Very good point. And in fact, the Irish Protestants who came, and my wife, by the way, descends from Sims and Lawrence families who were also among the Irish Protestants, like the British Protestants, tended to blend in. They were often of Scotch-Irish heritage and did not have that strong ethnic identity, but blended more easily. They were proudly Irish in their own way, but they did not associate with the Irish Catholics in the way that one might expect. And sadly, their story isn't as well documented. So they were enormously successful, but they are, in the words of the historian Charlotte Erickson, invisible immigrants.
Our next question comes from Susan Bolton, and it ties well into your last response. For anyone doing genealogy on their Irish ancestors, where in Iowa would you say is the best location for finding documents and records?
Well, they certainly should consult the Iowa Genealogical Society. And perhaps when the follow-up email is sent, that would be a terrific addition to the list of items that you and Jennifer are going to send, the email address for the Iowa Genealogical Society, because they have a robust program to help people find and trace their Irish ancestors. So I would certainly encourage them to go there.
Our next question comes from Leo Landis. Have you come across any military companies or regiments from Iowa that consider themselves an Irish brigade late in or immediately after the Civil War? And he asked us, a flag came to the State Historical Society in Iowa City. It has an Irish harp, and the number of stars places it in the period of 1867 to 1876.
It's a very good point, and I wish I could say I had more specific information on it. Woe be to anyone who writes a book, because you're always going to get very specific questions after the fact. I do know there was a real question as to whether or not the Irish were sufficiently patriotic, because, of course, there was a strong peace movement in the Dubuque area led by Dennis Mahoney. And in fact, Mahoney was arrested for what was appearing to be sedition. And so although the Irish did serve in units across Iowa, I don't believe there was any specifically Irish unit or company that came from Iowa.
Our next question comes from Jane Joyce. And she asked, how did New Orleans get to be used for immigrants?
It's a very good question. And New Orleans isn't as appreciated as it should be because, of course, it was a deep water port. The ads that appeared in the newspapers in Ireland made it seem that it was a more attractive and easier port to reach, and in fact cheaper. And in fact, what people perhaps don't realize is that New Orleans has a sizable and robust Irish population and Italian population. So people saw this as an opportunity to not only disembark at New Orleans, but then also be able to take steamers north. And in fact, Father Hoare, who I mentioned earlier, had the original intent of settling his people in Arkansas, but could not find suitable farmland. And so they pushed on past St. Louis to Iowa, where they established their colony at Wexford.
Perfect. Now, you talked a little bit in your lecture today about the the German and the Irish sharing a church. which
Right.
is very interesting. So a question came through. There were many large immigrant groups in early Iowa. We know, like the Dutch and German,
Right.
but how did the different groups engage with each other? Did they do well together?
Well, it's a good question because, of course, there's a lot of intermarriage between different Catholic groups, and particularly those in the larger cities. And so you do have German-Irish marriages. I don't mean to imply that they were at each other's throats in any way, but one of the benefits of having small communities like Melrose or Emmitsburg, or even in certain neighborhoods, is that you could, in effect, associate with your own. And so you ended up associating through church with other Irish, and in that sense, you didn't have the commingling of different ethnic groups. That having been said, you can see throughout Iowa different ethnic groups establishing communities, like Decorah or Pella or the like. And so different groups kind of created islands or isolated themselves a little bit. And because we had so much land and we could spread out, you didn't have that kind of inter-ethnic animosity that you might have found in bigger cities where different groups were kind of proximate to one another.
Now we have about 5 minutes left, and we have a good number of personal stories and recollections to go through. So I think we'll go through that next.
Okay.
I will say before we start, my English blood, if I butcher any Irish names, I apologize to start with.
Okay.
But let's dig in. We have some really good ones coming in. Elizabeth Verdon, she wrote in, I can definitely say my Irish grandma changed her community greatly. She may have been small, but she was mighty.
Wonderful.
Leo Landis wrote in about his family, Bridget Carmody Liston and John Liston, Irish immigrants to Marshall County, farm near St. Anthony. They are my great-great-grandparents. One of their grandchildren, Leo Liston, is where Leo got his name.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, Leo is a very traditional Irish name.
It is. And then we have R. Tawari wrote in, thanks for the presentation. I'm a descendant of Irish immigrants from County Cork who settled on farmland in Monroe County, Iowa.
Wow,
The
yeah.
Melrose Irish names of Deneen, Mullins, and Kildare.
The cover photo, by the way, is from the State Historical Society, and those are Monroe County miners, many of whom we think are Irish.
And actually, Linda Silverio wrote in, glad to see Melrose recognized here, was raised on a farm 2 miles west of Iowa's Little Ireland. Her uncle was on the 1937 basketball team.
Wonderful.
Aaron Minahan McCarty wrote in, my great-great-grandfather, Daniel Doherty from Donegal, founded Doherty, Iowa in Cerro Gordo County around 1863. My mother was a Doherty from Elkader, Clayton County. My father's family, starting with Patrick Minahan, came from County Kerry around 1858 and ended up in Fayette and Clayton counties.
I think it's so wonderful that what we're hearing is all this testimony, because it just shows how strong and vibrant the Irish community is still here in our state.
It's very true. Gene Carlson wrote in, no question, but a comment. My roots are from Cummings in the Irish settlement. And then let's look through here. Mary Schaefer wrote, my Irish settlers, the Burns and Donahues, came in through Canada and ultimately settled in Northwest Iowa, O'Brien County.
Very common, by the way, coming through Canada, because it was easier for the Irish to get to Canada, to get permission to board ships to go to Canada to another, in effect, British Commonwealth country than it was to get them into the United States.
She continues that Tim Donahue, settling near Sheldon to farm in 1878, and he served in Company E, 3rd Mass in the Civil War, and served in the 29th Iowa General Assembly for one session, and they founded St. Patrick's Church.
Wonderful.
A few other ones to kind of wrap up today. Betty Lopez wrote in, my Irish great-grandfather is supposedly the first Irishman to arrive in Iowa City. Family lore is that Michael McGinnis and his brother were stonemasons and set the cornerstone of the old Capitol building.
Could be.
And we have some fantastic stories. Laura Bishop wrote in, Nicholas Berry and his family made a difference in the pearl button industry in Muscatine. He also had a church built there. And then we see that Catherine Owens wrote in, my family's ancestors from Ireland settled in Bernard and Gary Owen area. Yes. So a great mix of personal stories. And like you said, it's great to see Iowa's Irish past still alive as we read our comments today.
Indeed.
Well, with that answer, we have a minute left. So we're going to start wrapping things up here. We'll bring this webinar to a close. And I say every program we do, but really this is true. I think we all can agree this has been a very informative lunch. So thank you so much, Jim.
Thank you.
Of course, and thank you to everyone joining us today, and happy St. Patrick's Day. We hope we would like to extend our one last thank you to our presenter again, Tim, and we hope everyone will sign up for the Iowa History 101 webinars that take place every week in March and on the second and fourth Thursdays throughout the rest of the year. There are many great stories from Iowa's past to tell in the upcoming months. Now, for more information and to register for future webinars in this series, check out our website at iowaculture.gov. This webinar and past presentations are available on our website as well. And while you're there, you can look into some other fantastic digital programs. We have our Goldie's Kids Club activities for young historians, or watch video recordings of the Iowa Stories series, which is hosted by our Iowa City branch. Again, we look forward to seeing you virtually here on Thursday, March 24th, as we continue Iowa History Month programming for 2022. Thank you all for joining us today and have a great afternoon. Happy St. Patrick's Day, everyone.